Hi, everyone. I'm Sabina Vaught. Kevin, Mosley, and I are having a dialogue for this session. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Sabina.
We made it. We'll just do quick introductions and then jump right in. I think many of you just came from straight from an hour-and-a-half long session. So we'll just sort of go slowly, and you can have us on in the background if you want. And hopefully we'll have time for a little conversation or questions at the very end. But I'm Sabina. I'm a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh. And thank you to Elon Dancy, the executive director of the Center for Urban Education, for inviting us to be in conversation today. And thank you to Fantasy and her team for making this all possible. To the ASL interpreters today, thank you for all your work. And please let us know if you need anything as we go. So Kevin, if you want to introduce, we can go from there.
Sure. First, I'm going to show everybody what I'm wearing. This is my Juneteenth shirt with the Juneteenth flag and the African-American flag, considering we just went past Juneteenth and we're also talking about abolition. I thought it'd be appropriate to wear that shirt. So my name is Kevin Mosley. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, include belonging and anti-racism in that, as well as an executive coach. I went through the program of Practices of Freedom, had a chance to take Sabina's course, and it was, I want to say, revelatory. Really helped me tie some threads together based on the things that I've done in the past. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
As am I. And we got to chat a little bit last week, right? So we're going to dialogue in front of and with you all based on that conversation and our time together in the course. And, you know, as if everyone could just do us a favor and make sure you turn your mic off, that would be fantastic. So as Kevin mentioned, he participated in the Practices of Freedom grant, and part of that participation was the option for people to audit or participate in one of our freedom seminars. And freedom seminars are 1 credit, ungraded courses that take up really one primary question of freedom broadly and education broadly. And so this particular one was prison schools and abolition. And we really joined in that space, not as teacher student, but as colleagues and peers and co-learners studying together in the study tradition that many of you know of as part of the Black radical tradition. So what we wanted to share with people today before we get in dialogue is that what's important in that study is not that we all agree, but that we have this sort of common purpose or common cause toward which and around which we're studying. And for us, that's freedom. So we're talking about some of the ideas and the learning that came up through that shared study, but really going to focus on the larger context of Kevin's study and how, you know, that one course connected us, but there's a larger conversation about study and sort of living in the practice of study toward freedom. So Kevin, when we talked last week, you said, quote, "Whether it's prisons, education, or policing, there's no such thing as reform. Society's always looking for reform, but this was not built for us. It was built for white people," end quote. And I'm hoping you can start us all off by talking a little bit about how you studied that social organization over the last 10 years and how reform and this critique of reform fits into your thinking.
So for those who don't know me, and that's probably most people in this talk, in this conversation, I was a Pennsylvania State Trooper for 20 years. And during the course of my time as a trooper, I got to see how policing was done for white communities and how it was done for other communities, particularly Black communities, and the war on drugs, which we'll get to. But ultimately, I used my time after I retired to travel around the country to go to various 50th and 60th civil rights anniversary events. And that really gave me an understanding of how we got to where we are today. Based on these conferences that I went to, there were people that actually lived that history at the time, particularly civil rights. So starting in 2013, I went to the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, D.C. Next year, I went to Freedom Summer in Jackson, Mississippi, their 50th. And then 2015, Bloody Sunday, and a march from Selma to Montgomery. And most people would think that, okay, the civil rights movement started with King back in 55 and Rosa Parks. And really, you'd have to go back to, in my estimation, go back to 1951, April 23rd, Barbara Johns in Farmville, Virginia, who organized, 16-year-old Black girl, organized 450 of her fellow students to walk out of Robert Musa High School because of the conditions, because they understood this separate but equal is anything but equal. And they understood they were not getting their fair share of the tax dollars that should have been coming their way. And they convinced, 1951, she convinced Thurgood Marshall to come to Farmville. And that was the first case that was rolled into, the 5 cases that were rolled into Brown versus Board of Education. So you had a 16-year-old Black student woman who convinced 450 of her students, fellow students, Black students, to walk out. And ultimately, we know what happened with Brown versus Board of Education. That led to massive resistance. That led to a number of politicians in the South, the Southern Manifesto, over 100 signing this manifesto saying, we want to keep things the way they are. We don't want Black students going to school with our children. We don't want Black teachers or Black administrators. So after Brown versus Board of Education, tens of thousands of Black teachers lost their jobs. And that takes me back to what Bell Hooks talks about, and her helping us understand through Teaching to Transgress her upbringing and how she was raised in a situation where the teachers were also Black. So that lived experience gave them an understanding of and helped them not only understand what they needed to do with their lives in the future, but there was also inspiration for them to see on a regular basis. And that brings me to today, not to like last week when you had the white principal in Philly deny the Black girls who, when I first saw that video, I thought, okay, the girl danced, the other girl blew a kiss. Are you saying that's why they weren't given their diplomas on stage? And that wasn't it. She was literally policing the Black people who came to cheer those girls on and what they had accomplished. And when I heard that, I was thinking to myself, it was crazy. But this is the society that we live in. And if we don't take time to study this Black history to understand how did we get here and why do people think they're entitled to do that, particularly to Black students, Black and brown students, we're going to have a hard time pushing back against where we are today, pushing back against the right and their efforts to cancel all things Black, particularly the book bans, Black history, claiming that CRT is the problem when CRT merely explains how laws are written to disenfranchise African Americans on a number of different levels. But there's more, and I can also, talk about, for myself and policing, it was just interesting watching how we, particularly with the war on drugs, how that was prosecuted against African Americans. And really, racial profiling was a huge part of that. And I don't think you can understand that. I mean, you do understand it when you're not as a police officer, but being in policing and seeing it done, and then having people say, yeah, we're looking for, I had arrested a guy from New York City, from Brooklyn, and he was a white guy. had to testify against him in the federal courthouse. After the court, I go over to the DEA offices with the lead agent. I'm sitting there with the lead agent from the DEA, and he says to me, you know, we're looking for young Black guys driving really nice cars. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm a young Black guy driving a really nice car. This makes no sense. And I recognized at that point, I had to do things differently. It was either I could assimilate and go along to get along, or which wasn't in my nature. I realized I had to do things differently, and I did. And I figured out a way. And this is where for me, there's no such thing as reform. You really have to reimagine how you can function within a system that wasn't established, set up for you and for your people, and figure out a way to be able to hold on to your job, but also produce the results that they're looking for, but not targeting our people when you're doing that.
I think what I'm hearing in your reflections, and I'm so appreciating your sharing multiple different experiences and connecting them, is that you're studying everywhere you are. So you're traveling to different commemorations or anniversaries and learning from people and learning from the history that they're sharing, their lived history, their lived experiences. You're studying, bell hooks. You talked to me about Angela Davis, studying 43,000 Black teachers lost their jobs in the 10 years after Brown, and sort of studying the complexity and the contradictions even of that particular history, and then connecting those histories. You talked about the principle, studying the way policing works, so that policing isn't understood as just residing with police officers, but with principals, with teachers. So what does policing actually mean? And how do you study it in your own work? How did you study it in your own work and navigating all those systems? And then how do you continue to study it, observing how policing is working? How does a principal police people and police them to sort of detrimentally impact their life conditions? I'm not gonna say possibilities, because their lives are their possibility, but in an attempt to do that. So I hear you connecting all these sites and practices of study. And you mentioned the war on drugs. You said in our conversation last week, you said, quote, "Whiteness tells history, and then we're faced with reality." And that struck me as so profound. I'm wondering if you can connect this framing or this observation that whiteness tells history and then there's reality, which you talked about in your response to the first question. If you could connect that to your decision to go into law enforcement, and then share some of the things you saw, that you studied, and experiences you had that were the reality, right? That were the sort of studying and building the new history.
Yeah. I think so. One of the books that I love is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria? And in that book, Beverly Daniels talks about why they are sitting there, and because they need to try to make sense of the just the daily lives, what they're going through in school, let alone outside of school, and then not understanding that you're only getting the education that system wants you to have. And it's not until you actually begin to become aware, even more so, particularly once you get to junior high, you start to understand things are different for you as a Black person. And it's when for me, it was a matter of really, literally when I retired, before I retired, but when I retired, I had the money to go travel throughout the South to all these various events. And every event, every 50th and 60th anniversary event, there were panels, which meant there were people who lived that history, and listening to them describe the experiences they went through the brutality, the things as far as not being even recognizing our humanity in various places. And we're not talking ancient history. We're talking not that long ago is, I think, the hard part for people to, well, people don't understand it because they haven't had the chance to study it. So once you have a chance to study it, as I did, that's when I began to realize there's so much more to this that we were not taught in school, and that that's when I understood that, yeah, we got the short end of the stick, and not just Black people, but everybody. And you really need to take the time to study this on your own to get to a point where you understand that it's not so much reform, because reform isn't going to do it for us. It's how do you reimagine the spaces that you're in? And then with policing, whether you go from education to policing, to courts, to prisons, to probation, there's the one common thread is the oppression and the maintaining control of us, keeping us in a place that if equity were present, that wouldn't happen to us. But because equity is not present, and that is purposely, then we have to come together in places like this and create our own spaces that will help us understand, okay, how do we fight back? And particularly, one of the things that Kimberly Crenshaw said on Juneteenth, she said, we remember that throughout our history, efforts to deprive us of our freedom have been routed through efforts to deprive us of knowledge. So, and that's really what it boils down to. And knowledge is power. And unless we take that time to understand and listen to people who are experts in fields, who have the lived experience, whether it is freedom, whether it was people, Black Panthers, and I'll tell you an interesting story in a minute, whether it's Black Panthers, whether it is people who are on the freedom rides, whether it was people who partook in the Montgomery bus boycott, or people like Barbara Johns. And I had a chance to go to Farmville for 2 days for for one of their anniversaries, and sitting there listening to them talk about, they shut down the schools in Prince George's County for 5 years. And largely, this is when the segregation academies are started. So white students were taken care of. The Black kids lost 5 years of education, lost pathways that they were never able to recover. And when you hear this and you hear from the people who actually live that, you begin to have a greater appreciation for the struggle itself, and the struggle that others, not myself, have had to go through, but you begin to relate to what they experienced. So it's just, and that takes me to, here we have that principal who decided that, what, yeah, it's not you, but what, your people out there are making noise when we told you can't do that. It's like, who does that? But this is where we are, and part of that, as far as the education and policing of Black youth, none of that's necessary, but this is what that weight we walk into the world with. And for me, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the things that's important in any space, and I think, and Bell Hooks talks about this too, well-being, the well-being of students, and how do you bring students into a space where the practice of freedom for her was about making it so that the teacher is comfortable, bringing the students into a space and actually seeing those students. And obviously that principal didn't care to see the students. She just cared about what I would call law and order. And law and order only serves one purpose, and that's white supremacy.
Wow. Okay. Law and order serves only one purpose, and that's white supremacy. And I'm trying to connect some things here, because you shared, you shared with me in some detail what you learned through the policies that came through the war on drugs. And you had said the war on drugs is a war on us, which sort of resonates with what you just said. But you also were talking about, knowledge and sort of the ways in which people are organized around knowledge. So we talked about, you shared your family's story of the Great Migration. And we talked about, there are these really consistent professions that kids of people in the migration went into. And we talked about that, that health professions, postal work, law enforcement, education, right? And they're all clustered. And so there's also the different ways in which we're understanding professions and who's taking them up and why, in what historical context. So I'm wondering if you want to talk about kind of through family and larger histories, how you arrived at the work, but then in the work, how the systems and the war on drugs, et cetera, kind of shifted what that meant for family, community, profession.
Yeah, I think I one of the things we talked about is how did I become a state trooper? And within this, for me, it was like, okay, that'd be a good job. Not knowing
an abolitionist dialogue.
So not knowing.
Let's see, just a second. Sorry, let me, Julie, if you don't mind turning off your mic, we're getting a little echo. There we go. Okay, great.
Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to become a police officer, I thought, oh, that'd be a good profession. But again, the miseducation, not understanding that history. But in reality, though, it ultimately was a good profession for me to go into, because now I was a use of force firearms instructor. I was an crash reconstructionist, trained by the DEA in drug interdiction. So for me, I look at the things that happen to our people in particular, and I look at it from three different perspectives: a perspective as a Black man, B, a police officer, C, a police officer who trains other police officers in use of force. So, and that, it was on one hand, I look at it as an accident, but it wasn't an accident, because the only way I was able to become a Pennsylvania state trooper was through the first consent decree in the United States to desegregate a large police department. And that case was brought in 73. And at the time, from 1905, the founding of the Pennsylvania State Police, up until 1956, there were zero people of color, zero Black people, no one other than white people who were state troopers out of over 4,000 troopers. Flash forward to 73, Bolden versus Pennsylvania State Police. Have to have this. He files a lawsuit. Consent decree is in place. Then they begin to open it up, because at that point, only 62 had been troopers, African American, Latino, Asian, and of those 62, only the 60 were troopers. Only 2 had any other rank. So if it wasn't for other people fighting for me, who didn't know me until I had the chance to come onto the job, I would never have been a police officer. I would never have been in a position to be able to do the things that I ultimately am doing now, with the knowledge that I gained through understanding how policing was used against us, how the war on drugs was prosecuted against us. I went through Operation White Line training. I understood what was supposed to happen. We were sent out there on a regular basis. The federal government paid for this, and you were supposed to come back with results, because they're spending money on you and they expected you to come back with the rest. And once I was told, hey, we're looking for young Black men driving really nice cars by the DEA lead agent in Pittsburgh, that's when I realized I have to do things differently, and decided I figured out a way to do it. And I can talk about this now because you can't do it anymore on Turnpike. What I did was I recognized that where's the most traffic? It's at the exits and entry points on the Turnpike. So I went up to Pittsburgh Interchange, which is Monroeville, every day. And I'd spend a little bit of time there, but when I was on my regular patrol for Operation White Line, I was sent on that. I would go up there, and you could stand there in the entry lane booths and look in the cars. That's perfectly legal. Windows, you can see what's in there. And it was interesting, because who was I beginning to arrest on a regular basis? Well, the people who drive the turnpike on a regular basis, mostly white people. So I was coming back with a number of arrests. I was doing my job, and I could live with myself in doing it that way, as opposed to some of the things that the DEA wanted us to do, which was profiling. So interestingly, in terms of who goes into what professions, I went to the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Black Panthers. And I have a sister that lives in Oakland. I called her and said, hey, do you mind if I come stay with you? And she's like, sure. But I have to go to UCLA because one of her grandkids was graduating from UCLA. So there's a big age difference between my older sister's family members and my younger brother, myself. So I get there, and my sister tells me, hey, you know, Eddie used to work with the Black Panthers, her husband. I'm like, what? And she says to me, yeah, he delivered half of the Panthers' babies because he was an OBGYN. Now let's go back to, how did my brother-in-law become an OBGYN who served in the Korean War? He was one of the few Black men to be able to take advantage of the GI Bill. Why was he able to take advantage of the GI Bill? Jim Crow laws. Because he's from Mississippi, they had laws that white doctors, white nurses could not treat any patients other than white patients. They actually needed Black doctors. He goes on to Howard. He's in medical school to become an OBGYN. My sister is there. One of my sisters is there. She's in nursing school. They meet, get married. He decides, hey, let's go back to Oakland because I really liked it out there. He was in the Air Force. They build a house up above San Francisco Bay. And of all places, they get together with 7 other Black practitioners. They build a clinic in, of all places, East Oakland, as the Panthers are coming along. So after my sister tells me this story and tells me about how they work with the Black Panthers, I'm thinking back to my childhood, and I'm like, I've been in that clinic, but you never talked about this. So I was like, why am I just now hearing about this? But it was the same thing with my relatives who were in DC, uncles who were in DC, who were there during the March on Washington, DC. I'm like, wait, why didn't you mention this before? Because for them, that was life. They lived through that. That was not a history-making thing for them. It was just part of their everyday lives. So I go to this conference for the Black Panthers, and just walking around looking at exhibitions between sessions, and I started talking to this woman, and I said to her, yeah, my sister is a nurse practitioner, and she said that my brother-in-law can't walk through the Oakland airport or San Francisco airport without running into somebody whose baby he's delivered. And she goes, oh, what's his name? And I said, Dr. Lampley. And she said, oh, he delivered my first baby. So I was like, okay. So my sister, just the history and how it ties in, and the things that we don't talk about and that we need to talk about to our relatives before they become ancestors and take those things with them to their graves. But I have another sister who went to Hampton, who was an educator and worked for Scholastic. You know, so when we talk about through lines and threads in our family, we're related to one of our family's Palmers. They passed for white, never spoke to us again after they did that. Well, my sister, who was the educator working for Scholastic, was on at a conference in Virginia, and that's where my dad's from. So that's where that side of the family's from. So she sees this white woman and sees her. She's got a name tag that says Palmer, and she walks up to her and she goes, "Oh, you know, my family is related to Palmers." That woman turned around, walked away, never talked to my sister the rest of the time. So it's just interesting, the hoops we jump through to try and separate ourselves from Blackness, and then by not talking about the historical aspects of our lives that at this point in time, we understand are historical, we deny our family members the ability to gain a greater understanding of what was going on at that time. What were you doing? How did that work? But it's just like, you know, in terms of Eddie being able to become an OBGYN, let's keep going with that story. His son follows in his footsteps, because now his father's already taken advantage of GI Bill, built this beautiful home in Oakland overlooking San Francisco Bay, worked with the Panthers, delivered half their babies. His son follows in his footsteps, goes to Stanford, goes to medical school. He becomes an OBGYN. At decides that, so at the time, Black doctors could only you could only go to do your residency or internship, Harlem Hospital and Cook County Memorial in Chicago. He ends up in Cook County Memorial. They live in, so my sister and my brother-in-law live in Chicago for a minute. Then his son decides he's going to stay in Chicago after he becomes doctor, meets his wife there, who happened to be works at the University of Chicago. Who does she work with? Michelle Obama. She works with Michelle Obama. They work on all their campaigns, and she ends up, going to visit Michelle in the White House. So for that to happen to a Black family is something that's, that's the exception. Would not be the exception were it not for how the Jim Crow was established and was utilized to keep Black people from taking advantage of the GI Bill. But that history, I look at the history of my family, and I look at the history of other families who I've met, people who were on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I met John Lewis, talked to him. One of the things I talked to John Lewis was about, what did it feel like to vote for the first time? And John Lewis just he thought about it for a minute. He said, you know what, we were just trying to do something. Because at that point, he's still in the struggle. He's not thinking about what it meant to vote. But then when you look at the show that Finding Your Roots, Gates, and he showed John Lewis that, hey, your grandfather actually had a voting card, actually had the right to vote. And John Lewis said, I never knew that. So, but that was something that his grandfather took to his grave and never told him, because at the time, at the time that he was growing up, it was a dangerous thing. So when we talk about professions, when we talk about history, we talk about these through lines: education, knowledge, understanding. The threads are all there. We need to talk to our family members to understand so why'd you want to become a teacher? Why'd you want to become a nurse? And what professions were only open to Black people? One of my brothers was a postal worker. And that because he's also served in the military, that was available to him. But you had so many things that weren't available to us thanks to white supremacy.
So I'm going to try to sort of elaborate on what I observed in your response to the previous question, which is you're deepening your description of how to study. So you're a kid in Pittsburgh schools, and you talked about what Kimberly Crenshaw said, the sort of withholding of knowledge, and you've talked about sort of white history as imposing these lies. And then there's reality, but I hear you describing reality as studying really complex and contradictory movements, laws. So you've talked about Brown v. Board and over 40,000 Black teachers losing their jobs. You've talked about Jim Crow laws interacting with the GI Bill. So this strange sort of contradiction that comes through white supremacy, and there's this very limited opportunity. And then the ways in which families experience movements and interactions with restrictions, like there are 2 places to do a residency in what we call the US, and how that study has led you to ask deeper and deeper questions about how you're positioned in this complex history and social order, why you're positioned in that place, what you can do, and then to arrive at these analyses again, that reform is really a white practice to continue to uphold supremacy and kind of tweak supremacy's organization. So I hear this, and at the level of family, and then back out to federal law, and then back to family, and sort of the ways in which the work of studying abolition, or the work of studying and thinking toward freedom, is this lifelong, multi-sided, very complex inquiry. You also said something which was really interesting, that it wasn't until you had money to be able to travel to meet people that you could learn their histories, because those are geographically enclosed in some ways. I found that fascinating as well. So you're talking about the resources that restrict or allow or encourage
Yeah.
or don't.
So speaking directly to that, my family's huge. So my mom and my dad. So my dad had 13 kids with his first wife. She dies. He marries my mom, 3 kids. So I have 15 brothers and sisters. So when we went on vacation, our vacations were to family members. We did not go to Disney World or anything like that. That was not even a thought. For me, so even as I got older and had money, I would go visit family members, but I would drag them along with me to these Black history sites or events and just make sure, or they would tell me, like if I go to Chicago to visit family, they'd tell me, oh, you want to go to DeSable? You want to go see where Emmett Till lived? Those types of things. So for me, once that gave me a freedom. This is, speaking of practice of freedom, that was how I practiced freedom, was using the resources I finally had at my beck and call to be able to learn that what I didn't learn as a child growing up, and utilizing that to, and thinking through, James Baldwin, to be Black in America is to be in a constant state of rage. I mean, every time you learn something new, it's like, oh my gosh, are you serious? But yeah, this is what happened to us. But you have to learn how to take that rage, and be able to articulate what happened, why it happened, and in pushing back against the systems that have been established to deny us. And I think for me, as I look back on, okay, how was my brother-in-law able to take advantage of the GI Bill? Fortunately, my sister was able to go to an HBCU. 2 sisters went to HBCUs. I have other family members who went to HBCUs. And you look back at that history. How did HBCUs come to be? How did we even come to be here? One of the conferences that I went to before the last summer before the pandemic, 2019. I went to Fort Monroe, Point Comfort, to the conference there for 1619, dealing with 1619 project. And that was, you go there and you hear about, what was it like for those 3 Black men who made it to Fort Monroe, which was the fort that ultimately Jefferson Davis was held captive in, was held after the Civil War. But those 3 Black enslaved men made it to Fort Monroe and were labeled contraband, and that was the next step. And they freed themselves. And fortunately for us, that general, who was white general from Massachusetts, decided, yeah, I'm gonna make you, keeping in line with the law at the time, we were property, you will be contraband, which gave us the ability to ultimately, through the Emancipation Proclamation, to self-emancipate, to free ourselves. And ultimately 200,000 Black men and some women fought in the Civil War. So when people say that, why aren't Black people thanking white people for their freedom? We freed ourselves. 200,000 of us fought in the Civil War. But these are things that were also kept from us in school. I remember studying the Civil War. We even took a field trip from here to Gettysburg. But do you think they mentioned Black people? Not once. Do you think they mentioned that Black men and women made up 10% of the Union Army, and that turned the tide of the war? Not once. But it wasn't until I was able to study these things out for myself. And a lot of these things I read in books, but also I went to one of the conferences that I went to was at the National Museum for the African Americans Civil War Monument and Museum in DC, where they had a parade on 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And they did this in DC, and they used reenactors because what Lincoln did at that time was he sent the Black troops down south. So Black troops weren't present at the parade celebrating the end of the Civil War. But that actually worked to our favor because then, you know, we just had Juneteenth. Granger goes down to Texas, and who's with him? Black troops. And they were there. They were going to make sure that the law was enforced as they understood it, and that Black people were free. So these things, you know, we think about education, we think about, for me, how I got to where I am and why it was so important for me to study these things. And it's because without that knowledge, without that understanding, I might be willing to assimilate, but there's no way in hell that knowing what I know, knowing what, being exposed to things I've been exposed to, you know, you go back, you study Angela Davis's writings on abolition and how she says one of the things you need to understand is that prisons as we know it did not always exist. You know, women were expected to just listen to their men. Women weren't being thrown into prison. Even African Americans weren't being thrown into prison because this is a European invention. It wasn't until after enslavement that they thought, now what do we do with these Black people? Oh, peonage. And we'll make sure this is how we keep them enslaved, keep them in a place where they still serve us. And until you begin to understand and recognize what happened after Reconstruction was destroyed by white people, by the system, what happened with, you know, during the Jim Crow years, and, you know, we just recently got an anti-lynching bill passed into law. And so when we look now at what is happening, yet then you begin to understand why these things are happening with this particular party and why it is that they are so against, you know, trying to ban books. Because like I said, I did learn a lot of these things through books, but I also was able to take advantage of my time and the resources I had to go to these various conferences and to experience, learn so much from people who actually lived it. One of the things that I was able to do was Emmett Till's family had a 60th anniversary pilgrimage to the sites that were associated with the lynching. Most people who haven't been there would think, okay, that he got kidnapped and then for Moe's Rights home and then he got lynched, right? There are like 8, 9 different sites where they have markers, historical markers telling you what happened in these various sites. And I remember the first time I went down there, and that was also 2015, summer 2015, August 28th. So I'm down there, and we had a large group of people with us at that time. There's like 100 of us. But still, we had to have a police escort because they understood this crosses 2 counties, this tour, this pilgrimage, and they understood that we have to have a police escort because this type of violence is still with us. And I didn't understand that. I kind of did, but I didn't until I saw the signs that were the historical markers. There were only 2 that were not shot up. And I mean, there was one right across from the courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, that was also shot up right across the railroad tracks. And as I'm looking at this, and I realized the only 2 that weren't shot up were the ones in Grenada, Mississippi, because it's an all-Black town, one way in, one way out. And there was no way any white people were going to drive in there unnoticed, shoot up those signs, and you know, get out in one piece. But those are the only 2 signs that weren't shot up.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, seeing that, I just realized, I just thought to myself, yeah, it brings it home. It makes you understand and recognize that this is dangerous. So 2 years later, we go back, and I went back, and I just happened to be thinking, boy, I'd really like to go back with a smaller group of people. His family does it again in 2017. So I go back with them in 2017, and there were maybe 30 of us. We're in two vans, 2 large vans, and we go back to the quote unquote the plantation forced labor camp where he was actually murdered in a barn. And in this, there's a white dentist that now owns this property, but he redid the barn, but he renovated the barn, but he didn't touch the stall that Emmett was murdered in. So we park up the road away from the plantation. We're walking across this little bayou to get there. And as we're walking there, and I'm walking behind his cousin who's in charge of his foundation, and here comes this on his golf cart, middle-aged white guy and a white girl. They get up to us and they go, "What are you doing here?" And I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, they know who this is. There's no way you don't know this is Emmett Till's family on August 28th. So I'm like, I'm just going to step back. I'm just going to listen and not speak up because this is not my show. But I knew his cousin was going to take care of it, and she did. She told him, she said, "Hey, we're here for the anniversary of Emmett's death, and we just want to pay our respects." And this woman goes, "Does my father know?" And that's how I came to know. Okay, you're his daughter, so you know what's going on. And the woman that set up the tour explained it to her. She said, "Yeah, I talked to your dad this morning. He knows we're coming." So she goes, "Okay, just as long as my dad knows." She drives off, and they drive off from the bar maybe about 30 yards. And there's about 12, 15 pickup trucks over there, SUVs over there. So we walk up to the barn, and just as we start the program, we hear gunfire, lots of it. And being a use of force firearms instructor, I understood that they're not shooting at us. This is about intimidation. They're shooting at targets away from us. That was that woman, her friend, and her other friends. And that gunfire lasted for about 3 minutes, where they just kept shooting and kept shooting and kept shooting. So we're talking 2017. And here you're talking one of the parties in power has decided that they want to continue that type of an atmosphere of intimidation in this country, but through laws that they are able to pass. Now, obviously, we understand just because it's legal doesn't make it right. We know it's not right, but it is. But in this, one, it's infuriating to have to go through all this all over again. But two, this is where we understanding our history, understanding lived experiences of others, understanding our own lived experience. We're at a point in time where we recognize that no, we're going to talk about this out loud. We're going to do everything in our possible to be to reclaim what is ours, to have the democracy, the multiracial democracy that we desire. But it's just, but unless you actually understand that history, unless you've had these types of conversations, it is hard, if not impossible, to be able to articulate, to be able to fight back, to be able to say why this is wrong. You might know it's wrong, but it's through this type of study, through Angela Davis's readings, knowing like here in Allegheny County, we have the West Penn, which is is not a prison anymore that they're trying to sell it, and we also have Allegheny County Jail, the old one that now houses judges. Those were two of the original prisons in this country. That's where that history stemmed from. That's where the history of the prison industrial complex stems from that. And honestly, I didn't know that until I started to really sit down and read Angela Davis's writings. And then I realized, oh, I've been in that jail when it was a jail. It's no longer functioning as that part's not functioning as a jail. So it's just interesting to read that. And that's why it's so important for us to read the history, understand why it is that Bell Hooks wrote Teaching to Transgress, why that makes so much sense, even though she wrote it in 1994, why it still makes so much sense today with the struggles that she had with trying to talk about feminism, why she stayed in feminism, why she talked about class, and and particularly also why she talked about being a Black woman and a Black student and a Black woman in academia, and all those lived experiences that she wants to relate to us, to help us to understand. And just reading that helps me in terms of the through line again. Well, it's about well-being. Without understanding, I'm a Black man, I'm not a Black woman. So, but once you read Bell Hooks, then I can gain a great appreciation for what a Black woman in academia it has gone through and will go through. And then she talks about class and being poor and her struggles in the classroom, thinking, oh, this is going to be a great experience going away to school. But then she begins to recognize, no, it's not the same. It's not what I imagined it to be. But I think with Bell Hooks, I think with her, it was about how do I reimagine these spaces, these white spaces, to make them serve me and the students that I need to educate.
So thank you for, you always, tell a story and then contextualize it in this sort of web of systems. And I think this story is a good connector to thinking about K-12 educators. There are a lot of educators attending CUESEF. And I wonder if we could give them, if folks have questions for you. I think, what you've done is describe the ways in which policing, so whether it's white people who own property and police a commemoration through intimidation, or it's police who terrorize and kill people and then have to provide escorts, or it's principals who police people's celebration and expression, that there's a policing across these contexts and dynamics, and that it, as you said, it reforms, it reformulates. And I'm wondering how we can help educators think similarly. So how educators may identify in their school, oh, there's a school resource officer, and we don't want, armed police officers in the school. Okay, how though do we help educators ask, how am I involved in policing Black people, Black life? And how do I learn? So you learned as a police officer through the war on drugs, you learned the ways in which the systems and the organizations are meant to terrorize Black people, and how to study that, how to observe it, and how to resist it and not reform it so that it's just a new expression. So I'm wanting to give educators a chance to ask you not literally about law enforcement, but to ask you about, well, then as teachers, how do they think about studying and undoing policing in their own professional work? So maybe we have, almost 10 minutes, not quite, but if people want to hop on and ask questions, that'd be fantastic. Or drop them in the chat. We can read them if you prefer to do that.
I know one of the things that when we got together at Practices of Freedom, I mentioned to Rachel, who's with us, about a card deck that Ibram X. Kendi came up with to help people interrogate their own lived experience. And we used it. And I thought he really asked some poignant questions. It really makes people think back to how they got to where they are on race. And he also has a journal that also gives people the opportunity to think through their own lived experience. And I've used that journal in my practice as a coach, a DEI coach, trying to help people gain a greater understanding of what does DEI look like in the space that you're in. And the journal is that both are good resources, but the journaling really makes people sit down and think through their lives, and why they think the way they think and how they can change. So I think that'd be a good place for educators to start, would be that journal.
Great. And Rachel, thank you for sharing. And then I shared a link to Critical Resistance, which is an abolitionist organization, and they have also good resources for K-12 educators. Anybody have a question or something you're reflecting on in your educational practice related to policing and abolition of policing? Rachel.
Well, one, thank you, and it's nice to see you. I was thinking about the tension between understanding what a system was designed to do, which is to oppress, to separate, to subjugate, to dispose of, to push to the margins, and the tension of knowing that and then going within it to disrupt it. So when you got these charges to target Black people, I think Black men specifically, and to say, like, whether it's saying, no, I'm not going to do that, saying yes, and then going out and not doing that. But I think about that type of disruption from within a system and how teachers also can understand what they are being called to do, you know, explicitly or implicitly within schooling education, within schooling systems, and how they can also disrupt to say no, to say yes, and then do it differently instead. I just want to hear more about that tension and that resistance and disruption that you have engaged in.
I think one of the hard things to do in any profession, but particularly, so one of the things I run into, my Facebook page, I switched it over to social justice like 10 years ago when I started this journey. And that was interesting because I started to get these pushback from white people who are white, who are friends, and they would ask me, what's with all this Black stuff? Now, mind you, I'm only putting Black history, posting Black history, but it was just interesting watching that interaction and having to have conversations with people who are like, I grew up just like you. No, you're white. You didn't grow up just like me. So the hard part with the tension is unless you've been having these conversations, all sides having these conversations, it's difficult to, one, know what you're talking about. And then even if you know what you're talking about, being afraid, going back to Facebook, I have friends who told me, I really like what you post, but I can't like it because people from work watch me. So those tensions are there, and it's always the policing that's always going on from various aspects of whatever profession that we're in. And I think that is another through line that all Black people experience. When we decide that we would like to just even mention race, we're looked upon as if you might as well be talking about the devil, as opposed to, no, these are conversations we have to have. And that tension is going to be there. And it boils down to, how are we able to channel our thought process and remain calm and having these conversations and being able to come forward with the knowledge and our expertise in answering and having those discussions. I know that another thing that I was faced with was just people who really, when you're faced with people who don't want to believe it, and sometimes you just have to push away from the computer. I had to do that in the beginning of doing this type of work. But then I got to a point where, you know what? I'm not going to get mad anymore. I'm just going to say what needs to be said. I'm going to put the evidence out there. And if you can't accept it, that is your problem. But I'm not going to get mad anymore. My blood pressure is not going up. That tension is not going to cause me grief. I'm going to tell you what the truth is and live with it. And if you can't, that's your problem. So I think tension wise, we have to learn to live with it, and we have to learn to channel it to our advantage and get to a point where we don't have to push away from the computer. We don't have to push away from those conversations. We can have that conversation and stay in the moment and recognize that I'm speaking the truth, and it's backed by scholarship, Black scholars, whichever, tons of scholars. And I think we do need to use Black scholarship when we have these conversations. And we need to uplift that Black scholars who are doing this work and let people know, this is who I rely on to help educate me. The system has failed me in the past, but I know these people are my people and they're not going to fail me.
I know we're at time, and I believe CUESEF is heading into lunch. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'm wondering, Kevin, if you want to just say some final words to educators.
I really appreciate having the opportunity to be in Practices of Freedom this past year. I have a bus tour to the National Museum of African American History and Culture that's scheduled for July 8th. If anyone would like to join us, it's $75. I will drop my email address in the chat, and you can contact me, and you can let me know if you're interested. But I'm doing this also because I want to give people a safe space, but particularly given that we might lose affirmative action tomorrow when the Supreme Court makes their announcement. And I think people need to be able to vent their frustrations and their angers with others. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this. But also I want people to be able to come together and strategize and talk about how do we overcome this? How do we push back against this? That's all I got.
Thank you for that, Kevin. And thank you for being in conversation today, for all of your work, and really for sharing with us the many ways in which you study and that we can all study. Very generous conversation. I'm very grateful.
Thank you. You're welcome. Grateful for the opportunity.